We are continuing our discussion of potential drivers of foreign policy behavior of states at the subnational or the sub-state level. Um, Here we're talking about lobbies or special interest groups in society and how far do they try to have influence on foreign policy and are they actually successful in doing so? Now, what is a lobby? A lobby is essentially an interest group, sometimes referred to as a special interest group or a political interest group. It's an organization, could also be a more loosely affiliated group of individuals who share a common set of concerns, or maybe just one concern, and they want to influence government policy that will affect those sets of concerns or that particular concern. Now, where does that term come from? Well, in the United States, um, there are stories of the Willard Hotel in Washington, D.C. that Ulysses S. Grant, President Grant, used to frequent in the 1860s and 1870s. He liked to sit in the lobby there and enjoy himself. And people would come there and try to influence government policies, hence the term lobbying, because he would sit in the lobby there. But in actuality, that term is quite a bit older. It comes from British parliamentary practice and experience. In particular, outside of the Houses of Parliament, there was a covered hall or a gallery, a lobby, where members of society could be representatives of businesses or of banks or just individuals would wait for the members of Parliament to come outside of the Houses of Parliament where they were debating or passing bills, and they would try to influence these MPs in ways that would make policy more favorable towards them, hence the term lobbying. Now in Washington, D.C., there's one street, K Street, that is symbolically used as a term for lobbies because many law firms are situated there that represent lobbies. So sometimes lobbying groups have their own lawyers, sometimes they hire lawyers to work on their behalf. In fact, foreign governments tend to do that as well. They will hire specialist lobbying firms to work on their behalf. So, how does lobbying work? How do lobbies try to influence policy? Well, the most common way is through money. Now, personal gifts are illegal, even though politicians still try to take them and they get in trouble if they're caught. But more commonly, campaign donations. An organization might say, we will donate money to your campaign, or we will organize campaign donation drives on your behalf if you align with our policy. They might do that with candidates for legislative office or for executive office, for instance, presidential or gubernatorial elections as well. Connected to that is vote. Politicians come to power in the United States through elections. And so, other than money, which actually may be secondary, the more important way that they influence policy is through getting the vote for particular candidates or stopping certain candidates from getting votes. So a lot of lobbies or interest groups will have publications where they signal approval or disapproval of particular candidates to their supporters. And they'll say, we support this candidate, we do not support this candidate. Connected to that, they will seek to mobilize their membership to vote for or against certain candidates. Lobbies with very large memberships, they tend to be most effective at the vote strategy. Lobbyists also influence policy, in particular through personal relationships and expertise. Oftentimes, lobbyists are former politicians themselves who understand the ins and outs of government agencies and how the legislative process works. They have personal relationships, pre-existing ones, with politicians. They offer research and guidance to legislators and say, look, we've done research on this issue. Why don't you rely on us? And in the executive branch, they'll develop connections with lower level bureaucrats and oversight agencies. If this has gone too far, and if the executive ministry or particular agency seems to be acting only on behalf of a particular organization, this can be referred to as agency capture. But oftentimes there will be a symbiosis a symbiotic relationship between lobbies and lower-level bureaucrats, which can be good, can be bad. An additional way that lobbies try to influence policy is through what is referred to as outside lobbying, influencing public opinion. So lobbies will oftentimes publish reports, they'll develop relationship with newspapers and TV channels and get their opinion out there in order to influence the wider public opinion about an issue that is dear to them. They'll also try to mobilize issue-based campaigns that affects the concern that they share in common with one another. Well, now that we know how lobbies try to influence policy, the next question is, what makes an effective lobby? Which lobbying group is more effective than another one? Well, obviously, if money is an issue, then wealthier lobbies are going to have a leg up. But wealth is not the only thing. Many lobbies are not particularly wealthy, but they have very large membership base. And if you can mobilize large membership base, then you have influence and power, particularly when it comes to elections. Just because you have a large membership base, however, doesn't mean that you're going to be very effective. You need to be able to mobilize them. You need to be able to move them in a way that furthers your goals. So you need to have an effective organization. So lobbies who have a more effective organization are also going to have their voice heard more. Beyond that, your message has got to have some resonance with a wider population. Maybe not with a majority, but at least with an influential minority. You need to have message resonance. Your message can't be something that is deeply unpopular with most people. And of course, personal connections. That's why lobbyists are oftentimes themselves former politicians.
The surest way to stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun.
Thank you.
We will be judged not by what we say, but by what we do.
The truth is, they want to ban every gun in America. It's just not politically savvy to admit it.
Hillary Clinton could take away her right to self-defense.
Senator Rubio, can you tell me right now that you will not accept a single donation from the NRA in the future?
We will stand and fight against any sure-to-fail form of government gun control. Their solution is to make you, all of you, less free.
Because half of you are so afraid of the NRA. But sometimes we're going to have to be very tough, and we're going to have to fight them.
The very best strategy to harden their schools, including effective, trained armed security.
Where a teacher would have a concealed gun on them, they'd go for special training.
As money is a very important element in gauging effectiveness of lobbies, here's a list of the top 20 spending lobbies in 2019. Unsurprisingly, by far the biggest spending lobby is the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which includes the American business sector and most major American corporations, I imagine. In this list, you'll also find Google, you'll find Facebook and Amazon, the big IT companies. The health industry is very well represented. Pharmaceutical industries, the American Hospital Association, medical insurance, and doctors associations. Very effective at making their concerns known. You also have other types of businesses, the realtors. You've got George Soros and the Open Society Policy Center. That's simply based on his own personal wealth and his desire to spread liberal values across the globe. You also have a couple of defense industries, Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman. And then on the other column, you can see the lobbies by sector. Again, most of them have to do with domestic politics, but there are a couple of sectors that are relevant to foreign policy, particularly the defense sector. Other than money, the most important resource that lobbies have are their membership base. And so this is not an exhaustive list of the top organizations according to membership, but it's an overview. Now, the organization in the US, the lobbying group that has by far the largest number of members, is the American Association of Retired People, AARP. And they are particularly effective because people, US citizens who are in retirement age, tend to vote to a much larger degree than younger people. And so politicians are very rarely going to make policies that are going to hurt the interests of people who are above a certain age. Labor unions, particularly the American Federation of Labor and Congress of Industrial Organizations, which include a number of different unions, 12 million, they're a pretty powerful group that can mobilize a lot of people. You can see that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which spends the most money, has a lot fewer members. Well, it's because they tend to rely more on the money strategy than the membership base strategy. Now, foreign governments also try to influence the U.S. government in Washington, D.C. through lobbying. In 1938, Congress passed the Foreign Agents Registration Act, FARA. It was essentially designed to make sure that anybody acting on behalf of a foreign government is registered. This act was later amended to focus on activity that was seeking a political and economic advantage, whereas in the beginning it had been targeted at people who are trying to disseminate propaganda. Presumably this was in the build-up to World War II and the Nazi threat and Nazi propaganda and perhaps even communist propaganda. But later on, this focused primarily on groups, on states who are trying to get political and economic advantages through lobbying. An example for this from the Pakistani perspective is Stephen Payne. He's a well-known lobbyist. He was part of a group of people referred to as Team Eagle, which were tasked by the Pakistani government to try to lobby the U.S. government after 2001, particularly through President Pervez Musharraf, to try to loosen sanctions that had been put on Pakistan after their nuclear tests, and also to help push through U.S.-Pakistani military deals. Now here's a list of countries ranked according to how much money they spent on lobbying. It's a bit surprising, to be honest. Japan and South Korea top the list, and most of that has to do with trade relationships and making sure that U.S. trade policies don't hurt their interests, because the U.S. is a large market for Japanese and South Korean products. You also have small island countries like Bermuda, the Bahamas, and the Marshall Islands. It'd be interesting to dig a little bit into that, what that means. Some of it may have to do with guaranteeing and protecting their tax status as tax havens. You have the the usual suspects of Saudi Arabia and Israel, which has a lot to do with security policy. I imagine Qatar has a little bit to do with that as well. And then you have countries like Ireland, which rely a lot on American tourism. So these are some countries that the top 10 countries in terms of spending on lobbying in the U.S. In addition to foreign countries that try to lobby for their interests, there are also American organizations that represent Americans, often from a particular religious or ethnic background, that have foreign policy objectives. One of the most powerful such foreign policy lobbies is the Cuban American National Foundation, which is largely made up of Cuban exiles who moved to America, particularly in the mid-20th century in the wake of Fidel Castro's revolution. And they're, of course, very anti-Castro regime. And they are one of the major factors why relationship between Cuba and America was non-existent even after the end of the Cold War, because they represented an important electoral constituency in the state of Florida, and nobody wanted to make them angry and lose an election. Therefore, they Florida legislators tried to oppose policies that would lead to better relationship with Cuba. Of course, that has changed over time, but they're a very influential lobby. You have two lobbies that tend to want to have America have a closer relationship with India, the United States India Political Action Committee and the Hindu American Foundation, and they tend to be more closely related to BJP governments. And they have quite a bit of influence in Congress as well, certainly more so than their Pakistani counterparts, where you have an organization like the Association of Physicians of Pakistani Descent of North America, which I suppose represents a large number of Pakistani background Americans, but has nowhere near the influence that these organizations that are close to India have. There's also the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, another American lobby that tries to make sure that the United States takes a balanced perspective when it comes to the Middle East, and particularly conflicts connected with Israel. None of these lobbies with foreign policy objectives are as powerful as the main one that we're talking about today.
There are very few lobbies working the corridors of Capitol Hill with as much clout as AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. They're the people who tell the Congress which legislation affecting Israel they like and which they don't. They are not agents of the Israeli government, but out of personal conviction as American Jews, they lobby the Congress and the administration for measures that support the state of Israel. But the charge is that apart from lobbying, AIPAC also gets involved in election campaigns by setting the tone, the line, for about 80 pro-Israel political action committees around the country, pro-Israel PACs, that have given $6 million this year to a variety of candidates. One race they're focusing on is the senatorial contest in Rhode Island, where they say Republican Senator John Chafee has a poor record on Israel, and they want him out. In Rhode Island, we tried to talk to Senator Chafee as he arrived at a state park celebration near Providence.
How are you, sir? See you.
Nice to see you.
Good.
Senator Chafee had told us earlier that he would not agree to a formal interview about the subject of our report, but we had made clear to him and his press people that, like any reporter covering any candidate, we felt free to ask questions at any of his public appearances.
Why does AIPAC, why do the pro-Israel lobby find you so unfriendly?
No, I'm not going to get into that, Mike, and you and I had the ground rules here.
Okay, if the governor and the senators are telling me.
Rhode Island has a population of only 1 million, so a senatorial campaign here should be cheap. This year, it's not.
Richard Leach went to the U.S. Senate. Help me out in November.
Richard Leach, who is challenging Chafee, is the state's lieutenant governor. He has also been an active member of the U.S. Jewish community. The money from pro-Israel PACs that Leach has received comes totally from out of state. Altogether, almost $200,000 of the $2.5 million he'll be spending has been given by 45 pro-Israel political action committees.
Good afternoon, Leach for Senate.
But add to that hundreds of thousands of dollars more from individuals all over the country, many of whom are tied to those same pro-Israel PACs. Earlier this year, Senator Chafee had written to constituents attacking so-called outside forces, who he said are pouring hundreds of thousands of dollars into the campaign, hoping to buy a seat in the United States Senate. Why, asked the senator.
Good luck. Thank
Chafee, as we said, had refused us an interview. Richard Leach did not.
The United States Senate.
Richard Leach is hardly a household name in California or Arizona or Illinois or Florida, and you've never voted in the Senate of the United States. So the question is, how come these pro-Israel PACs know that you're so reliable?
They know that Richard Leach can win this race for the Senate. Any candidate for the United States Senate raises a tremendous amount of their money from outside of their home state. You can look at any candidate. My opponent, John Chafee, has raised almost twice as much political action committee money as I have. He and I have both raised more money.
Not a penny from pro-Israel. Why? Is he against Israel?
I don't believe he is, but you'd have to ask him what his position on that
Well, I shall. But that, as we had found out, was the only subject John Chafee did not want to discuss in public. In fact, on many key issues, like aid for Israel, John Chafee, as he reminded some of his Jewish constituents in this Rhode Island synagogue, John Chafee has been a strong supporter of Israel.
Senator from Rhode Island.
His problem, though, is that he has not voted 100% to demonstrate the political loyalty demanded by AIPAC and most pro-Israel PACs. Example, Chafee voted against legislation that would have had the U.S. government close down this PLO mission to the UN in New York, a measure the U.S. courts later found to be unconstitutional. But what irritated the pro-Israel PACs most were Chafee's votes over the years to sell sophisticated military equipment like this AWACS surveillance aircraft to moderate Arab regimes like the Saudis, even though Chafee was on the record saying,
Israel's military dominance in the area is not going to be altered by this sale. If it were to be altered, I would not support the sale.
Several prominent Jewish Rhode Islanders, like Republican Larry Goldberg, have tried to convince the pro-Israel PACs that Senator Chafee deserves their backing.
And I think that the exaggerated fundraising, has really not been fair to his record.
What do you mean exaggerated fundraising?
Well, we have raised hardly any money from the pro-Israel community.
The Palestinian uprising against Israeli occupation and the headlines it has produced, all of that has hurt moderates like John Chafee, says Goldberg. Why? Because it raises the anxiety level among pro-Israel Jews in this country and makes them anxious to find congressmen they can count on 100%.
And they may look more carefully at Senate races, even far away from where they live, in order to see if there's a candidate that they can support who will be more pro-Israel than the one that they have there now. And I think that's the way that it plays out.
Inside this building are the headquarters of AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. They would not let us photograph inside their headquarters. AIPAC says it is the spearhead for support for Israel here in Washington. It is not a political action committee. It does not make campaign contributions. But the clout of AIPAC here on Capitol Hill is legendary.
Practically every congressman and senator says his prayers to the AIPAC lobby. No, they've done an enormous job of corrupting the American democratic process.
George Ball was number 2 in the State Department under Presidents Kennedy and Johnson, and he has never been reluctant to criticize the pro-Israel lobby.
It's the most effective lobby in the United States today, and I would put that ahead of the National Rifle Association.
What's wrong with picking a candidate to support on the basis of the way that he has voted? Isn't that the American way?
I think it's a caricature of the American way.
The word power, when it's used for AIPAC, is a myth. It's baloney. AIPAC is powerful only because the American people are behind Israel.
Rabbi Israel Miller is the vice president of AIPAC. AIPAC is not anti-Chafee.
No, AIPAC has put on the public record his votes on some of the issues that concern us, but we deal with a very politically aware and sophisticated group of people, the pro-Israel community, and they make up their own minds. If we were
You don't direct them?
We do not direct them.
Let me read to you a memo, an AIPAC memo, November 3rd, 1987. Senate race. Lieutenant Governor Richard Leach, Democrat, Rhode Island, is running against incumbent Senator John Chafee, Republican. Leach, who is Jewish, has a very good chance. Our problem is that the pro-Israel community is not excited and as forthcoming as they should be. We need to put the word out on this race, emphasizing Chafee's poor record. The focus should be to generate interest for a terrific candidate to replace a poor supporter of our issue. See attached voting record and Marty's analysis. It's an AIPAC memo.
Who signed it? I don't recognize it as an AIPAC memo.
Rabbi Miller continued.
In this case, I think all that was being said was that Leach has a chance against an incumbent senator.
Who has a poor record. And we got to get the word out.
His record is not as poor as some other senators.
Shortly after that interview, AIPAC confirmed that the memo was in fact written by a former AIPAC political staffer. But they insisted she was a low-level employee and that her memo did not reflect AIPAC policy. And that's important for AIPAC because under U.S. federal election regulations, if it were shown that pro-Israel PACs were working in conjunction with AIPAC or were coordinated by AIPAC, that would arguably be a violation of the law. Well, shortly before this broadcast, 60 Minutes received in the mail from an anonymous sender another memo written by a high-level AIPAC official, Liz Schreier, in which she urged a colleague to make certain that several pro-Israel PACs around the country funnel cash contributions to a handful of senatorial candidates. AIPAC officials acknowledged to us the memo was indeed an AIPAC document, but they declined to answer any questions about it. They said in a statement that despite appearances to the contrary, AIPAC does not have the power to direct fundraising decisions. Now, who are other senatorial candidates in current races with what pro-Israel PACs call poor records on Israel? Well, for instance, this year, many pro-Israel PACs are trying to defeat incumbent Senator Chick Hecht of Nevada, even though he is Jewish, because he too did not follow the AIPAC line on weapons sales to the Arabs. And there are many who charge that AIPAC, with its sights set only on Israel, is just too demanding of U.S. politicians.
We aren't demanding of U.S. politicians. We have a concern about Israel, which is understandable, particularly in this generation. Had you and I been in certain parts of Europe, we would have walked to Auschwitz together. We're very sensitive about the security, about the future of Israel, and support of Israel means that we feel that it is in the interest not merely of Israel, but also in the interest of the United States. Israel is a strategic ally of the United States.
In recent years, AIPAC and the pro-Israel PACs have helped defeat, among others, Congressman Paul Findlay and Pete McCloskey, Senators Harrison Schmitt of New Mexico, Walter Huddleston of Kentucky, and Chuck Percy of Illinois. Like Senator Chafee, Percy too came out in favor of that sale of AWACS to the Saudis.
I finally reached the stage where, as chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, I saw our foreign policy totally turned around. With a Muslim world, 800 million people looking askance at the United States of America, what is happening, who is running the foreign policy. Can Israel and the Prime Minister have more power than the entire Senate of the United States or the President of the United States? And that, to me, I simply said, enough is enough.
That particular AWACS sale to Saudi Arabia did manage to pass the Congress, and in 1984, pro-Israel PACs and other individuals spent millions to unseat the powerful Senator Percy. Let me just quote to you the words of the executive director of AIPAC, Tom Dyer. After the defeat of Chuck Percy a few years back, he said to a Jewish group in Toronto, quote, "All the Jews in America from coast to coast gathered to oust Percy, and the American politicians, those who hold public positions now and those who aspire, got the message."
It was an unfelicitous expression of that which Tom felt in his enthusiasm and in his zeal. I think if he had it to say all over again, he would have put it altogether differently.
Rabbi Miller, about a year ago, the New York Times wrote, AIPAC has become a major force in shaping U.S. policy in the Middle East. Organization has gained the power to influence a presidential candidate's choice of staff, to block practically any arms sale to an Arab country, and to serve as a catalyst for intimate military relations between the Pentagon and the Israeli army.
How did AIPAC become so powerful?
Again, I'll say that that's very flattering, but it's a myth. It's just not so. The American people support Israel, and therefore Congress votes as it does.
One of Israel's staunchest supporters is Senator Daniel Inouye of Hawaii, who says that AIPAC has nothing to do with his feelings about Israel.
If I can help Israel help herself in every instance, I'd do so. I'm also convinced it's in our national interest. I've yet to see any country in that part of the world that is as reliable as far as our strategic requirements are concerned as Israel is.
I don't believe it's an ally at all. We have no alliance with it. I mean, they insist on total freedom of action, and they insist on our subsidizing their total freedom of action.
The amount of that subsidy is remarkable and a testament to AIPAC's clout on Capitol Hill. Altogether, Israel gets more than $3 billion a year in assistance from the United States.
Sometimes the votes go through without a single debate involving billions of dollars. You couldn't spend that kind of money in this country without a huge debate going on. But a foreign government gets this money without debate because simply it's just organized to get it.
Why does Israel get more aid, more U.S. aid, than any other country in the world? $700 per Israeli per year, as opposed to $50 per Egyptian per year, as opposed to $2 per African per year.
None of this money goes for the $700 goes to raise the living standard of Israeli people. This is for their defense. This is for the security of Israel. If Israel were destabilized, the Arabs, with all of their petrodollars and with all of their weapons, would just sweep Israel into the sea.
Is there a possibility of a backlash if Israel is perceived as too powerful in the halls of government here in Washington?
There's always this possibility if people begin to believe that little Israel is calling the shots. And I'm certain Americans would resent that. They won't want any country, big or small, to be calling the shots in the Congress of the United States. But I don't think that AIPAC is calling the shots as far as I'm concerned.
Is it common sense or cowardice on the part of senators who just don't want to talk about this?
Oh, I would say the senators would say it's just being practical.
This past week, 3 major Jewish organizations took issue with AIPAC. The leaders of the American Jewish Committee, the American Jewish Congress, and the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith asserted in a letter to the president of AIPAC that AIPAC does not speak by the consensus of the organized Jewish community. And in a CBS News poll of 1,530 American adults 2 weeks ago, we asked, do you think that in order to preserve the security of Israel, the U.S. should give Israel more aid than it gives any other country? 13% said yes. 72% said no. 15% said they don't know.
The Israel Lobby. What is the Israel Lobby? Well, the article I assigned to you by Plitnik and Tensing is an overview of the original piece that was written by Mearsheimer and Walt, titled The Israel Lobby. And according to Mearsheimer and Walt, the Israel Lobby is not one organization, but it's a loose affiliation of a number of organizations that can be divided into 3 categories. You've got American Jewish interest groups, most importantly the American Israel Public Affairs Committee and the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations. You also have the Anti-Defamation League, which pays particularly close attention to any anti-Semitic activity in the U.S. You have the American Jewish Congress. But AIPAC is by far the most important and powerful organization among these groups, and you watched the video earlier. And they're particularly powerful because American Jews tend to vote in much higher numbers than other ethnic or religious groups in America, and so they tend to be an important constituency that American politicians have to pay attention to. And this is bipartisan. Republicans and Democrats in general all try to have good relationship with the AIPAC. You also have Christian pro-Israel groups. These groups and churches and affiliates have religious motivation. They believe that there's something special about the state of Israel, that it somehow signaled the fulfillment of biblical prophecies. And so you have different organizations. You have Christians United for Israel, you have Stand for Israel. They have their own motives, but they believe that America needs to be pro-Israel in its foreign policy. You also have major pastors and televangelists like the now deceased Jerry Falwell Sr., who were very staunchly pro-Israel. And lastly, you have pro-Israel think tanks and media watchdog groups. The Washington Institute for Near East Policy is a particularly well-known pro-Israel think tank. You have the Jewish Institute for National Security of America, and then you have a media watchdog group like CAMERA, which pays attention into how far media is reporting on Israel and whether they think there's something unfair or biased about that coverage. So all these three groups of organizations are what Mearsheimer and Walt refer to as the Israel lobby. Now, nobody disputes that organizations like AIPAC are quite influential and powerful. But the question is, does the Israel lobby actually influence U.S. foreign policy? And so there are those like Mearsheimer and Walt, who are ironically realists, but still argue that domestic political actor can have an influence on foreign policy. And so there are those that argue that yes, they do have an independent effect or impact on foreign policy. Now, what are their arguments? Well, to begin with, they argue that organizations like AIPAC have such a powerful impact on foreign policy elites in the U.S. on both sides of the partisan divide. Both Democratic and Republican leaders have very good relationship with AIPAC for electoral reasons, and so that alone shows their influence. And it's going to make these policymakers a priori more amenable and more sensitive to Israeli national interests. Secondly, according to this argument, America has supported Israel in its conflicts with its Arab neighbors, even against its own interests. So, for instance, in 1973, in the Yom Kippur War, America supported Israel, even though that led to a decision by the oil-producing states to cut production and make oil very, very expensive. That hurt the American economy. And so we can say that America's support for Israel had adverse effect on its economy, but still America persisted in its support of Israel. Similarly, in Israeli incursions into Lebanon, America has tried to temper criticism by other states against Israel, and one could say that might hurt American interests because it is seen as not a neutral arbiter. Thirdly, U.S. has also clearly supported Israel in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Although at times America has tried to mediate between the two, it's always been perceived as clearly on the Israeli side. And one could argue that this has hindered an ultimate solution in Israel, and it has also led to reduced American image and influence in the Middle East region because of its support for Israel in this Israeli-Palestinian conflict, particularly among the masses of Muslim-majority countries, and particularly those in the Middle East. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict has a lot of importance, and so America suffered, particularly in its image and its influence, because it is so closely associated with Israel. And lastly, according to this argument, the influence of the Israel lobby was felt particularly after 2001 within the George W. Bush government. There's a group of people we can refer to as the neoconservatives, people like Paul Wolfowitz, Richard Pearl, who had a long-standing interest in getting rid of Saddam Hussein in Iraq. They had been disappointed that George Bush Sr. had not done so at the end of the first Gulf War, and they'd been itching for an opportunity to do so. And the terrorist attacks now gave them political capital to do so, and they were now in power. And so they influenced the Bush government to not only, well, they were not particularly interested in Afghanistan and kicking out Al-Qaeda. They were particularly interested in getting rid of Saddam Hussein, who was seen as an existential threat to the state of Israel. And so this argument states that their influence was particularly strong after 9/11. Now, on the other side, there are those that argue that, yes, AIPAC and other organizations, they're quite influential and powerful. And yes, American policy is pro-Israel. But that does not mean that the lobby influences U.S. foreign policy. At its essence, this is a realist argument. Domestic factions cannot influence foreign policy behavior. It is the national interest that determines foreign policy behavior, and that is in turn determined by the structure of the international system and the neighborhood, and one's own size, of course. In this sense, there's a couple of arguments. Okay, fine, America supported Israel, but Israel was a cost-effective tool to try to counter Soviet influence in the region. So the Soviets had developed relationship with Arab nationalists, the Ba'ath Party in particular, Nasser in Egypt, and in Syria and Iraq as well. And so supporting Israel, America was actually getting more for its money. It was supporting military, giving military aid to Israel, and Israel was defeating these other countries in conflicts. Furthermore, Israel is not the only ally that the U.S. supports. Egypt gets almost just as much military aid as Israel does. America has, of course, a very famously close relationship with Saudi Arabia. So according to this argument, Israel is just one of several U.S. allies in the region, and it's part of an attempt to balance regional politics in American favor. So whatever America does that is perceived as pro-Israel, it's actually pro-America because it is in favor of American interests and not against American interests. And then thirdly, and connected to that, America has supported Israel to oppose Arab nationalism, and Arab nationalism has posed a threat, particularly to the oil-producing states, the Gulf Cooperation Council states that are led mostly by monarchies. And so this has driven American policy more than some innate pro-Israel orientation. Lastly, second to last, after the Cold War, and particularly after 9/11, America was not driven by so much a pro-Israel inclination as a desire to have American hegemony. So the neoconservatives were not primarily driven by a motive to protect Israel, but to spread American influence in the region. So this was not a pro-Israel move. This was a pro-America move, and at least in terms of how neoconservatives perceived it. And lastly, the argument goes that the American public do not need a lobby to push them in a pro-Israel direction. They're already pro-Israel. So lobbying makes no difference. So this is the argument against the Israel lobby's influence on U.S. foreign policy. Note that this argument does not say that America is not pro-Israel. It's simply saying that it being pro-Israel is not because of the lobby, but because of its own national interest. Okay, now it's your turn to put into writing some of the things that you've learned. So to begin with, think about a special interest group, a lobby that may have influence on Pakistan's foreign policy. This should be a non-governmental group. Be as specific as possible, and then describe how they might have an influence on Pakistan's foreign policy. Secondly, and do so in a paragraph. And secondly, list and explain what you think are the top two arguments for and against the influence of the Israel lobby. So discuss two arguments for the Israel lobby's influence and two arguments against the Israel lobby's influence, and then tell us what do you think is the more persuasive argument. So that's your writing assignment for the week.